Now, let's see if I can proceed here. I'm going to sit down so you people can see behind me. Hopefully this thing will work. I'm going to skip real fast through some of these pictures. This was my twin brother and I graduated high school in Jacksonville, Florida, a little over a month after Pearl Harbor. We were home for maybe 10 days and we entered the University of Florida as freshmen. They had a ROTC unit there, horse-drawn 105 millimeter howitzers. The horses were real, the howitzers were real, our rifles were made out of wood. That's how prepared. We couldn't fire them, of course, and this was the uniform. That's why the uniform was riding pants, jodhpurs, because it was horse-drawn artillery. This is my brother and I. Once we finished basic training, we were offered several options. First option was to go to officers training school. We said, what's that about? And they said, well, in 3 months you'll come out as second lieutenants. They called them 90-day wonders in those days. We looked at each other and said, well, if we do that, then they're going to separate us. They're not going to let us come out together. They'll send us to 2 different outfits. So what else is available? Well, they said they just started an Army Specialized Training Program. They'll send you to some college, take courses in engineering. I said, boy, going back to college sounds good to us. So we agreed to that. We ended up Syracuse University for 3 or 4 months. Then they transferred us to University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. After a few months there, some Army general figured out they had 100 and something thousand young Army soldiers in colleges. They needed them for combat duty. So they disbanded the program. They sent me to the 42nd Infantry Division, Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. They put me in the infantry unit to start off with. Here, all my training was both at the University of Florida and at basic training, Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was as a gunner on a 105 millimeter howitzer. My twin brother had the same training. They sent him to the Mojave Desert, the 104th Timberwolf Division, in training for the North African campaign. Also, he was in the infantry. Then they transferred him to Pikes Peak area in Colorado for the Italian campaign, still in the infantry. He put in 3 requests to his captain to be transferred back to the artillery where I was in Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. Nothing happened. He went to his captain and he said, what's the status of my transfer request? The captain said, my job is to train you, not transfer you. Well, he wrote a letter home to our mother, told her the situation. She wrote a letter to President Roosevelt saying that she wanted us to serve together and we wanted to be back together. Sure enough, she got a letter from the White House saying, it wasn't signed by President Roosevelt, it was signed by a general, his aide, the president's aide, saying that as a 2-star mother, her request would be granted, but it didn't say who's going where. Then she got another letter from the War Department basically saying the same thing. Finally, cause for celebration, she got a 3rd letter from the 104th Division headquarters saying Howard was going to be transferred to my outfit. His captain tried talking him out into refusing the transfer. He told him, sir, he's an Army soldier, he obeys orders, he's ready to go. They sent him to headquarters. Some colonel tried talking to him the same thing. The reason is he found out later the officers knew that within a couple of months they were going to be the 1st division to ship over direct to England. Direct to France. Prior to that, all the divisions went to England first. They didn't want to lose Howard, highly trained, to be replaced by some kid fresh out of basic training. Anyhow, he joined my outfit. He reported in our Army serial numbers with only 1-digit difference. They thought it was me coming back because I had gotten emergency furlough from the Red Cross because my mother was seriously ill in the hospital. They didn't know if she would make it or not. So I was home in Jacksonville, Florida when he reported in. They thought it was me coming back early. They didn't believe him that he was my twin brother until I showed up, and of course then they believed it because we were identical twins. This was a picture taken at Nuremberg, a suburb of Nuremberg, Firth, Germany. Our unit captured a German air base. We were in direct support of an infantry company. So Howard went into one of the buildings and saw a stack of German white silk parachutes. He took his bayonet and cut off a nice piece of fabric to make himself a nice neck scarf, as you can see, because it was wintertime. Of course, at that time, our howitzers were quite a distance apart, so I didn't see him till a couple of days later. And I asked him, well, where's my neck scarf? He didn't make one for me. I'm going to skip these pictures, move along to get to that. This is me as a gunner somewhere in Germany. I'll skip this story about the water can. We don't have time. Okay, then we were on early the morning of April 29th, 1945. We were on a 2-lane road. The next military objective was to capture Munich. We were 9-10 miles north of Munich. We got orders to pull off to the right side of the road, which is a small clearing and a wooded area on the right. There was also woods on our left. Normally, when we went into various gun positions, we were never set up our guns inside any city or town, because that's where the infantry guys were trying to capture. We were always on the outskirts. Depending on the terrain and the situation, sometimes our 4 howitzers would be quite a distance apart. In this particular situation, the clearing was just large enough to accommodate the 4 howitzers. So we were very close together. Everybody smelled a very strong odor. One of our Jeep drivers came by and he said, it must be a chemical factory in the woods on the other side, the left side. My brother Howard came over to me. He said, he don't think there's a chemical factory over there. To him, the odor reminds him when we were kids. Our mother used to go to the meat market to buy a freshly killed chicken. In those days, you had to buy the whole chicken. You couldn't just buy parts. She would take the chicken home, hold it over the gas flame in the stove in the kitchen to burn off any remaining pin feathers. In so doing, it would burn some of the skin and the fat of the chicken. He said that's what it reminds him of. So I asked my gun sergeant permission for Howard and I to go over through the woods and find out the source of this strong odor. He gave us permission. He said, but don't stay too long. We don't know. We had done some fire missions towards Munich. We didn't know how long we were going to be in that position. So he said, don't stay very long. Get back here. So we took off. We walked through the woods, and maybe about 15 minutes later, and sometimes these pictures are not in the exact order. This is a picture of the surrender. Now, we were there early the morning of April 29th, 1945. The actual surrender took place about 2:30 that afternoon. Our assistant division commander, General Henning Linden, was ordered by General Collins, our commanding officer, to take his bodyguards and so forth there and meet up with this SS junior officer, Lieutenant Weichert, to accept surrender of the camp, the prisoner camp. And I'll tell you the layout, show you the layout of the prisoner camp. And next to the prisoner camp was a huge German army camp that controlled the prisoner camp. We'll get to that in a minute. It just so happened in combat The 36th Texas Division was always on our right. The 45th Thunderbolt Division was always on our left in combat. So two divisions were always in action, while the third, one of the three divisions had a day or two of rest period. And that's the way it worked. So this is on the right, if I can reach this pointer here, somewhere here, it's pointing. On the right is the prisoner camp. Well, it does work sometimes. Not working, it's not pointing in the right place. Anyhow, on the right, you see those barracks. Those are concrete. That's what the barracks look like. And then on the left is a much larger German army camp that controlled the prisoner camp. If I had this pointer, I could show you where the main entrance to the prisoner camp is, but for some reason it doesn't seem to want to work. Oh well. I'll skip this sign. Now, when we approached, the first thing we saw was a line of railroad boxcars. We climbed over between two of the boxcars. When we got on the other side, this is the first thing we saw. We had a little Brownie box camera that we had liberated a couple of weeks earlier. The only film we had was the roll of film that was inside the camera. So we didn't take pictures because we were waiting. So we took this exact picture that you see here. This is not the picture that we took. I'll explain the guy that took this picture, because this picture, he had an official, he was a sergeant, name was Don Patterson. I met him many years ago, introduced to him on a telephone conversation. He was in Kansas, lived in Kansas. Don passed away early last year. He told me in several phone conversations, in his tank, he had an official Army camera with plenty of rolls of film to take combat pictures from his tank. He said his tank was about halfway to Munich when they got orders to turn around, backtrack, and enter the prisoner camp at Doc Howe. He said they never told him what they wanted to do or why. He said they got to the prisoner camp, they entered it as the only tank that actually went in the camp about 4:30 that afternoon, which was a couple hours after the camp was officially surrendered. He started taking pictures, he said, about 5 o'clock. So this is the actual picture he took. I have the original picture that my brother and I took, but it sort of faded out over the years because the Brownie box camera was not quality-wise anywhere. This train, which later was referred to as the death train, it had left Buchenwald concentration camp 20 days earlier before arriving the day before at Doc Howe. They loaded about 3,000 Jewish prisoners at Buchenwald into these railroad boxcars. Wintertime. They put a porcelain pot in each car. That was the bathroom. They gave them a supply of raw potatoes and a couple loaves of black bread. Closed the doors, put the padlocks on, and away the train went. The reason why it took 20 days to get to Doc Howe was because they had to make a lot of stops. Number one, to take on more coal. Number two, sometimes they would hit a track that was bombed out. They had to wait until the track was repaired. But 20 days later, they arrived at Doc Howe. You couldn't see it in the previous picture that I showed of the camp, but at the time there was a railroad track that went very close, maybe 25, 30 yards from the entrance to the prisoner camp that were the closest to railroad cars, and this one that we saw was right close to the entrance. And the train went around. Actually, the first 3 or 4 cars were open cars. They were actually inside the German army camp, because that's how the Germans got supplies, by train. The train would actually go inside the gate to the German army camp. So these were open cars. The prisoners were just sitting in open cars, like you see when you see railroad cars that have trees, loaded with trees, tree trunks and whatever, limbs. That's what they looked like. They had German soldiers as guards on each one of them. And all those soldiers were dead when they arrived. Different reasons why. I read one story where one time the train stopped at a train station to take on more coal, and one of the prisoners asked the German guard, could he go inside the little train station to use the bathroom? German guard told him, yeah, go ahead. He got about halfway, German guard shot and killed him. That's the kind of things that they did. Anyhow, there was only a few survivors of all these railroad cars. I met one of them in Doc Howe at the 70th anniversary. He told me his story. I wasn't sure if he was being truthful or not, so I asked him a question. When you got out of the boxcar you were in, about how close were you to the entrance to the prisoner camp? He thought a second or two and he said, about 25 or 30 yards. Then I felt he was telling the truth, because that's what I remembered. Another picture that Don took inside another boxcar. You can see my pointer was working. You could see some raw potatoes right in the center down below.
Yeah, this is a pointer. It doesn't work on the glass.
Oh, that's what it is, yeah. Anyhow, just more dead bodies. This is basically all we saw. Everything was quiet when we walked into camp. And this was hours before the official surrender. This is just a picture I got off the internet. It's just representative about the only thing we saw. A few prisoners leaning up against one of the barracks. I say everything was quiet. It was just 42nd Division soldiers just walking around. We didn't know anything about such camps. We didn't know what we were seeing. We didn't understand what we were seeing. This is the inside of one of the buildings. Just more bodies stacked up. This is the outside pictures that Don took outside the camp. There was a moat, the electrified fence. The reason why these dead bodies, and there was a lot more of them in different places around, was because about some months earlier, the Germans had run out of coal. They couldn't operate the ovens. So that's why the bodies were where they were. Had they had the coal, there probably wouldn't have been any bodies laying around, because they would have already been cremated. This is a picture taken by my son when we were there for the 70th anniversary. The crematorium was not in the prisoner camp. It's actually located in the German army camp. If you go there today, they kept there's a small bridge that goes from the prisoner camp into the army camp, and they kept a small section of the moat that's still there. You cross over that bridge, and that's the first thing you see, this sign. These pictures, it was raining. Every day we were there was a very light rain. Not a heavy rain, but a light rain. And this is the Crematorium Building. This is the room where the prisoners were told to remove everything to take a shower. These are just two of the 3 or 4 ovens that you could see there if you go today. These pictures were taken by my son. Then we went into Munich as part of the ceremony. We were there for some of the ceremonies took place in Munich and some actually at Doc Howe. The first ceremonies took place in Munich. Myself and 2 other Rainbow Division soldiers, which see their picture in a minute, were there. We were introduced to a special ceremony to some German government officials. And making the introductions, one of the German government officials thanked us for liberating Munich. I looked at him, I said, "Sir, at the time we thought we captured it." He responded by saying, "No, you liberated Munich from the Nazis," because the original headquarters of the Nazi Party was located in Munich. There was a huge mansion, estate, called the Brown House, B-R-A-U-N, the Brown House. The Nazi Party took over that mansion and estate. They also, as their headquarters, they also took over all the surrounding buildings for all their different officials and the SS headquarters and everything. There was one building right across that the opening ceremonies was at, called the America's House. After the war ended, they called that building the America's House. Today, it's in more recent years, it's some sort of educational building, college, small college or something, for the fine arts. I'll skip this. This is the new synagogue in Munich, inside. Saturday night, the General Consul of America, William Moeller, and his wife had a special reception in honor of military liberators of Doc Howe. Great event. These were some of the generals that were present. All standing were Army and Air Force generals, except on the far right was a master sergeant. At the bottom in the uniform was Pete Pettis, infantry platoon leader. I don't have time to tell you Pete's stories. He had a couple of interesting ones. Next is me. Next to him is Arthur Burns, also in the infantry. Also, he has some interesting stories about Doc Howe. The last on the right was Don Greenberg from Philadelphia. He was actually in the 45th Division. He claimed he was a liberator of the prisoner camp. Not true. When I first met him in Poland about 11, 12 years ago, a special event for liberators, I asked him a few questions. And I found out, yeah, he was there, but probably there 4 days, a week after the liberation, simply, and there were 2 others that said the same thing, and questioning them separately, I came to the same conclusion based on the answers they gave me. Because what happened when the first 42nd Division units came into the camp, the first aid people came, and then they brought in ambulances and so forth. They didn't mess with any of the dead bodies. They were gone. They only dealt with those prisoners that appeared to be near death. Those were the ones they dealt with and they were trying to save. And I don't have time to tell you also some interesting stories of some of the liberators. Some of the survivors, I'm sorry, and liberators. This was a very interesting occasion. This museum, the German government, Bavarian government, built this new museum. It's actually 4 stories high. The windows are supposed to look like prison bars. The site the museum was built on was the site of the original Brown House mansion that was the original headquarters of the Nazi Party. That's where the museum sits, on that same ground. This is another interesting story. I'll try and make it real brief. The hotel we stayed at in Munich, early, my son and I came down real early one morning for breakfast before the bus would come to pick us up to take us to Doc Howe every morning. And there were 2 elevators. In the lobby they had a bar, and then next to the bar they had a sitting room where people apparently in civilian life would go into the sitting room, order their cocktails, beverages, and they had knickknacks on the tables, peanuts, whatever. So we got off the elevator, and the next elevator, an older woman and a middle-aged man got off. They went into that sitting room. So my son said, why don't we follow them in there and introduce ourselves and ask them if they're here for the same reason we're here. So we did. Turned out they said yes, they're there for the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Doc Howe. Well, the woman, the elderly woman, went on to tell us a story that her father, when the brown shirts marched in Munich, her father was a citizen of Munich, and he was protesting the brown shirts. Police came and arrested him, took him to jail. The middle-aged man said his grandfather was a young Jewish lawyer. His client was the man that was arrested for protesting the brown shirts. He went to the judge to get his client released. The judge said, I'm sorry, he's staying in jail. He called in the police officers to arrest the lawyer. This is the lawyer. They took the lawyer. What you see is his underwear. They cut off his pants at the knees. That's his long underwear. They took off his shoes. So that's his long underwear. It was wintertime. They put that sign on him. You can't read it, but they had him march up and down a couple of blocks of downtown Munich, and the sign basically said, he will never speak against the Munich police again. And that was his punishment, to walk up and down in the wintertime with that sign.
It says he will never complain.
Yeah, never complain about the the Munich police again. So it was just an interesting story. When we got into the museum here, we saw this picture, and we already knew the story that we had just heard firsthand. Okay, this is Doc Howe. This map, the bold signs that you can see, is where every concentration camp was. The pointer's not working. Doc Howe is down at the center and the bottom. The little dots all around every one of them were sub-camps. The sub-camps were located within 40 to 50 miles around every major concentration camp. The purpose of the sub-camps were they would take prisoners from whether it was Doc Howe, Buchenwald, or some of the other camps. They would take them to the sub-camps, and they would take the healthiest prisoners to work in nearby factories. I talked to one survivor from Holland. He wasn't Jewish, but he told me that he worked at one of the sub-camps. His job was to work in a nearby BMW factory. He said, we were making engines, not for BMW automobiles, but for German airplanes. And that was his job, to manufacturing process of making engines for German aircraft. And there were other stories that I met, other work camps, different factories. One was working in an underground factory, making the bombs, the U-2 bombs that they were going to use to bomb England. not bombs from airplanes, but bombs from the ground. This is what you see if you go there today. The original barracks were destroyed. Those were just the concrete foundations of all the barracks. If anybody, I hope I've woken you up if you fall asleep, and if you have to leave, feel free to do so. The guard tower that you see, interesting. This camp, Doc Howe, was the model camp that all other German camps were modeled after. So the guard towers you see here, you see the same guard towers at all the other camps. Quite interesting. And we'll have a close-up picture in just a minute. My twin brother went there for the 50th anniversary. I couldn't go for business. The reasons I couldn't go. He went, and he said when he got there, it looked like what you see on these pictures. He told them, why did they destroy all the original barracks? They said, well, they were dilapidated, falling apart, which really was not true. They got rid of them on purpose. And I'll show you in a couple of minutes, they built a couple of barracks supposedly to look like the original barracks. The reason why I say it wasn't true was because when we were in Poland about 11 years ago at the camps there, the famous Auschwitz, and then Birkenau, which was built by the Germans from ground up 2 miles from Auschwitz, and we were there, and some of the original barracks were still there. You could go inside of them. So I'm sure the same thing was true at Doc Howe. This is the replica barracks constructed during the 1970s. They look nice, new, pretty. This is inside. There again, they look nice. And my brother said he told him when he was there for the 50th anniversary, they made it look more like a Boy Scout camp. This was the entrance to the prisoner camp. This building, called the Ur House, contained the SS officers, still there. Actually, when we were there, to the left facing this building was another building, which they destroyed at some point. That building was where the prisoners were first brought, not into this building. They wouldn't go in this building, but they brought them into that building for indoctrination. And I'll show you a picture of that inside that building. This was a huge temporary building they put for the occasion. And on the right, you can see in the distance with the blonde hair was my wife, Betty Ann. Next to her was my daughter-in-law. And then me coming this way is me, Pete Pettis, and then Arthur, Frank Burns, rather. This was quite a story. The woman taking the picture there, not the one closest to you, but the other one, she was taking pictures of us. The guy with his hand up is a young government attorney from Holland, terrific guy. We still stay in touch via emails to this day. He adopted myself, my wife, my son, daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. There were 6 of us, and he adopted us. It became our personal guide, so he was a godsend for a few days. It just so happened, the woman taking the picture, when she got through, everybody started to leave. She started singing out loud. She had a terrific voice, God Bless America. Well, everybody that was American in the building joined in. We were all singing God Bless America. It was quite emotional. This, when you go there, there's 3 memorials, Protestant, Catholic, and this one's Jewish. For the occasion, this was Sunday morning. For the occasion, each one had a service, a separate service. they had put up a large tent, attached a very large tent to each memorial. And it was, there again, a light rain. When I got off the bus, they insisted on me sitting in a wheelchair because it was a lot of water puddles and muddy. So my son was pushing me in the wheelchair. And when he pushed me inside the big tent where this memorial was, all the seats on both sides were full. On the left was loaded, packed with TV cameramen, still cameramen, reporters from around the world. And the seats on both sides were all full, so he just put me in the aisle, a very narrow aisle in the center, in my wheelchair. So when it was over, and they're trying to get out, well, the people from the front, the speakers, it was very difficult. They had to wait their turn. So I look up and there's Chancellor Angela Merkel of Germany standing right next to me. So I looked up at her and I thanked her for her remarks that she had spoken, and she thanked me for being a liberator. It was all over, a couple of minutes. One thing I did notice and still remember, after the luncheon meeting and all, they had another huge tent. When she left, there were 2 black SUVs outside. She got in one of the black SUVs, nothing fancy. They took off, no sirens, no flashing lights, just took off. And I couldn't help but compare that to what happens when our dignitaries, and especially our president, goes somewhere, even in a foreign country. They got to make a big Hollywood splash, sort of a pompous event. Make that comparison, think about it. This picture, Jerry and Roslyn Convoy. Jerry was a survivor. They live in Montreal, Canada. They have a daughter and grandchildren living here in Atlanta. I asked Jerry, I said, Jerry, where were you at early morning, April 29th, 1945, which I asked every survivor that I met the same question. He said he wasn't in the camp. Well, where were you? He said the day before he was part of about 2,000 Jewish prisoners put on a forced march. It just so happened early the morning of the 28th of April, a representative from the Swiss Red Cross arrived with 2 trucks of provisions. He had permission to arrive at that camp. He spoke to the SS general in charge, told him the American army was coming close. He had a choice to make. He could keep his men there, because he had 100 and something, mostly young German soldiers plus some SS officers. He could fight against overwhelming odds, or he could arrange a peaceful surrender of both the German camp and the prisoner camp and save a lot of lives. The SS general said, well, he'll take his men and go defend Munich. As it turned out, he had no intention of going to Munich and defending. He wanted to end up in the Austrian Alps, called the last redoubt. So he took a couple thousand of the most able, healthy-looking Jewish prisoners on a forced march. They had, I'll show a picture in a moment, they had German soldiers marching along, walking along with them as guards. And they went on this march. So Jerry said, just before they got to the Austrian border, suddenly the German soldiers, all the German officers were in vehicles. The German guard jumped in the vehicles and they all took off and scattered. They must have got the word that the first units of the 42nd Division were coming close. So he said that's when he was liberated. When the first American soldiers found that group, that's when he was liberated. I was scheduled, this is one of the buildings at Doc Howe, I was scheduled for a TV interview, would you believe, from Chinese national television. So I was on the way to the interview, and this group, they had just finished interviewing another liberator from Romanian television. So they surrounded me and started asking me questions. I answered some of their questions. Then I had to excuse myself because I said, I got to go to a room down the hall for this interview. In fact, that was quite interesting because I asked, the interview lasted a little over an hour on camera. I asked the Chinese woman during the interview, help me understand why a Chinese television crew is here at Doc Howe for this occasion. She said, well, during the war, the Japanese soldiers committed atrocities in Manchuria. And the Chinese people, ever since, have been very interested in the atrocities that the Nazis committed. So that's why they were there to film it. She not only sent me a CD of the whole interview, but she sent me a second CD of how it appeared on Chinese television. And of course it only lasted, well, the program lasted maybe, I don't know, 7 or 8 minutes. My part was only a couple of minutes. Everything was in Chinese, but they had some great pictures. And of course when I spoke in English because they picked it up from the interview. But it was quite interesting. I can still click on it today, but when I do, I get what's happening today on Chinese television. This is a sculpture at Doc Howe. This was the desk. I mentioned the building next door to the entrance to the prisoner camp. The prisoners would first report in there. They would stand in front of this desk. They had to tell their name, their birth date, and what city they were from. Then they were ordered to sit in a chair alongside the desk, which you cannot see. Under the chair, the Germans had an apparatus so that when a prisoner sat in that chair, they pushed a button and he got a shot in the rear end, some kind of shot of some kind in the rear end. And of course the prisoner immediately jumped up, but that's what the chair in the desk was for. Germans were great, great record keepers. This is Pete Pettis and myself at the entrance. You can see Arbeit macht frei, the famous German slogan. This is me coming out of the shower bath. Brausbad is shower bath in German. So I'm coming out of the so-called shower room, which really was the gas chamber. It just so happened that particular building, what the Germans originally, that site was First World War was an ammunition depot, and that building housed various ammunition and bombs till the Germans converted it into the gas chamber. And this is again a closer picture of the guard tower. The top, of course, was where the guards would station to look out. The second floor was the kitchen. The bottom floor was the bathroom. And that was the way it worked. This was, of course, the moat, which was in the electrified fences. This was a woman. I was in the wheelchair coming out that Sunday morning. The woman on the right was the daughter. That was her mother on the left. She was a survivor. So I asked her the same question. Where were you at? What were you doing early in the morning of April 29th, 45? She said she was so ill with typhus, she didn't know what was going on inside the barracks or outside the barracks. There again, the Germans, as organized as they were, they had the Jewish prisoners all separated in certain barracks. Prisoners that were from Western Europe were separated in certain barracks. Prisoners that were from Eastern Europe were separated in certain barracks. They appointed a prisoner as a leader of every barracks. They called them composts. And that was another story I've read, and you have possibly also, where they said when the American Army arrived at the prisoner camp, some of the prisoners took rifles from the American soldiers and killed German guards. Not true. What they killed were the composts, who actually were prisoners. They were like foremen. They would be in charge of taking prisoners on work details outside the camp. Behind the prisoner camp, they had a large garden. They grew vegetables for the German soldiers. The composts would be the ones to take the prisoners to work in the garden or on repairing nearby railroad tracks and stuff. But a lot of the composts were worse than the German guards. It was their way of showing the Germans that they were helping them, so they got better rations and better treatment. So that's who the prisoners killed. So anyhow, she told me she didn't know what was going on. Typhus. It took about, when we were there, we found out later there were over 30,000 prisoners still in the barracks. A high percentage of them suffered from typhus, lice-borne. That's why all the Germans could do was shave the hair of the prisoners. The Germans had nothing to kill the lice. When the American Army came in, we had DDT powder to kill the lice, which also took about almost 30 days before they eradicated the typhus. I could talk for hours, so nobody has told me to stop yet. A few more pictures. This is my family. On the left is my grandson Adam. He's a psychologist in Chicago. My daughter-in-law Laurie, myself, my wife, my son Jerry lives in Country Club of the South here in Atlanta, and my granddaughter Kelsey. She's works in Manhattan, New York. She's a buyer. She worked for 8 years as a buyer for Bloomingdale's. Now she's starting later this month. She starts her new job as a buyer. I'm trying to think of the name of the dress chain. They have 2,000 stores through the United States, here in Atlanta as well. I forgot the name. That's the end of the pictures. Questions and answers. Anybody's got questions, I'll be glad to answer them. I'll stick around as long as anybody wants to stay and ask questions.
I got a question for you, Hilton.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could tell the story about the time you saw the German Me-262 jet fighter.
Well, I'll tell the story. It may be X-rated for some. But in training, we were well trained. They showed us silhouettes of every aircraft, every Allied aircraft, every German aircraft, so we could recognize them if needed. The object says, well, if they get close enough, you could fire your carbine and try and hit the pilot. Big joke. Impossible. Anyhow, so one morning, I had to go to the bathroom. Well, we were in combat. We were on our howitzers 24/7. Rain, sleet, snow, cold, you name it. We had to stay right with our howitzers because we could get fire missions anytime, morning, noon, or night. We had our sleeping bags, and that's where we slept, right alongside the howitzer. Never indoors. But early one morning, I had to go to the bathroom. Number one and number two. So what do? You go about 50 feet or so away from your gun, You dig a hole, lower your trousers, squat down, and do your business. So that's the position I'm in early that morning. Suddenly I look up and I see the one and only time I saw a German jet fighter plane. Looked like he's coming straight at me. For an instant, I felt I could reach up and shake hands with the pilot. Fortunately, he was started strafing, firing on targets behind me, because behind us were the 155 millimeter howitzers. Behind them were the 240 millimeter howitzers. So that's who he was more interested in than us, fortunately. But I can tell you, so the experience only lasted seconds. But it helped relieve. We were also told that if we ever saw one, the jet aircraft could only fly in straight lines. They were not maneuverable at all. So that's why sometimes American or Allied aircraft could get ahead of them and actually shoot them down because they knew they couldn't maneuver. But that was the story that Jake. And I could stay here the rest of the afternoon, tell you all kind of stories. And one of them I'll take a quick minute to tell you. I showed the 5-gallon water can picture briefly. We carried 5-gallon water cans on our truck, hauling our howitzer, for two purposes. One, and the same cans also, the supply trucks had gasoline that the gasoline needed to operate the trucks. So water, one was for drinking purposes, and the other was after every so many rounds we'd have to wash out the gun bore to get rid of the powder residue before firing more missions. So at Würzburg, we were on the outskirts of Würzburg, and there were a number of buildings. My truck driver and one of the supply drivers went into one of these warehouse buildings, and they saw cases of French champagne and cases of miniature jugs of different kind of fruit brandies, apple brandy, cherry brandy, and so forth. They loaded as many cases as they could on those two trucks, brought them back to the gun position. Okay, we took the cases of champagne. We emptied out all of our water cans. We filled them with French champagne because the water cans, before we could, every time we could refill the cans with water, we had to put in chlorine tablets to purify it for drinking purposes. The champagne tasted a lot better than the chlorine water. And we felt they did a lot better job of cleaning out the gun bore as well. Then the guys started drinking these little miniature jugs of various fruit brandies. They all thought it was like fruit punch. They're all drinking away. Didn't take too long. Fortunately, we had we had just been given a 2-day rest period outside of Würzburg. So I think there was maybe 10 of us, including our 4 or 5 officers, that were sober. The rest of them were all drunk. We know, it's a good thing we didn't have any fire missions. We were in a rest period because we were inoperative. In fact, I remember one kid we got as a replacement, 18 years old, fresh out of basic training. Never forget him, Virgil Sacchi was his name. He got drunk. He's waving his .45. He's looking for the mess sergeant because the only time we saw the mess sergeant kitchen crew was when we had a rest period. They would come up and cook us a hot meal. He didn't like what they cooked that morning. He wants to kill the mess sergeant. Of course, we were able to grab him, take the gun away, put him in his sleeping bag and zip him up until he's sober.
Hey, Hibby, did your mother, I mean, after the Sullivan brothers, a lot of brothers didn't serve together.
Right.
After the Sullivan brothers were lost. Your mother didn't have any problems with you two serving together in the same unit?
No, we wanted to be back together again. Simple reason, 2 reasons. Number one, when you're thrown together with a bunch of strangers, who do you trust? If you got a relative or a good buddy right close by, you know you can trust them regardless of what the situation is. You got somebody you can trust without any question. The second reason, which my brother expressed, if something happened to either one of us, at least one of us would survive to be able to tell our family what happened if we were close together. And that was the reasons.
Okay.
I heard, I'll take a minute, I don't know if there's any Marines still here. Is any Marines still here? Okay. When the story I told when my brother and I were speakers years ago to downtown Atlanta, to the organization that's the government landlord for all government buildings. Forgot the name of the organization. Yeah.
General Services.
General Services Administration. So before speaking, we were introduced to a Marine general that flew in from Washington for the occasion, because this was Veterans Day of that year. So he told me that there were going to be a number of Marines in the audience, because there were a lot of people there, a couple of hundred. Well, I had to say something about the Marines. What could I say? So I told him that my brother and I were born in Jacksonville, Florida. It's a big Navy town. We didn't want to join the Navy because we were afraid we'd get seasick. We didn't want to join the Air Corps. We were afraid of heights. That left the Army and the Marine Corps. So I said, while we were willing to fight for our country, we were not anxious to die for our country. So we joined the Army instead of the Marine Corps. Needless to add, I got a standing ovation from all the Marines present. Yeah.
First of all, sir, I happen to be the son of 2 survivors. My parents were children during the war. They survived. And I'm the grandson of a victim. My grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was killed in Auschwitz in 1942. So the first thing I want to say is thank you for 2 things. Thank you for the job you did then, and thank you for the job you are doing now. Because you know, people, one day they have to go. Things they can go to, but testimonies last forever. What you're doing now will last forever. Now, 2 quick details. The complexity of the German concentrationary system is beggars the mind. Indeed, there were camps and sub-camps, but there were also sub-camps of sub-camps, and so forth, and so on and so forth. I met a historian at a conference 4 or 5 years ago. He said, unfortunately, I can't remember his name, but he is he works at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And his job is to track and find all the locations of places, facilities that were somehow attached to the concentration camp system. At the time, he was at 48,000. I'm not making this up. 48,000 locations, and he said that by the time he's done with his project, he'll probably be in the 60,000 area. Second thing, there is a myth, and I want to call it that. It's a myth that there is not enough documentation to explain what happened. Well, that's a myth. especially now, as the generation, the German generation that fought World War II fades away, their families are finding a lot of documentation. There's a book that's causing a lot of interest right now. It's called The Ravine. It's a picture of the Holocaust by bullet, I think in Latvia. And it was found 3 or 4 years ago. And the historian was in a position to reconstruct the whole story behind that picture.
Pardon me, I don't want to cut you short, but maybe somebody else has a question they want to ask.
Just wanted to say what you're doing is participating in a very important effort, which is documenting something that can be documented.
Right. Any other questions?
I got a quickie.
Yeah.
When did you hit France and when did you get home? How long were you in Europe?
Well, the war ended, as you know, May the 8th, 1945. We served in the Army of Occupation until March, late March of 46. And we shipped home on a Liberty ship, the SS Madagascar. We called it the Mad Madagascar. And back to Fort Bragg, where we had our basic training, we were discharged. So actually we served in active duty for 3 years and 1 week. We got credit for longer because we were in the Army Reserve Unit for some months earlier. But that was the extent of it. Tell you a quick story. I mentioned Pete Pettis. Pete was a platoon leader. He and 9 other soldiers was the platoon. So approaching Munich, Pete told us they gave him a map and they pointed out where this Brown House was in Munich, the headquarters of the Nazi Party. And they gave him orders to take his platoon, locate that Brown House, because they thought that may be some kind of information there, records of some kind that could be important. And if so, they wanted them saved. So Pete took his men in the map and they found the Brown House. He said it was actually bombed out, except the basement was intact. Everything was intact in the basement. So they went in the basement and that's where they lived for over a week. He said in the main dining room, they had china plates with Hitler's initials on them. They had packets in drawers of silverware, forks, knives, spoons, all with Hitler's initials on them. So instead of eating their meals, their rations, K1s, whatnot, in their mess kits, they ate them on the china plates with Hitler's initials on them. And every meal when they got through eating, they would go outside and use the plates as frisbees, smashing the plates. He said one day an Army officer came in, he collected some of the silverware and took it with him. He said, well, they couldn't carry much. He took 2 complete place settings of silverware with him. He said that's all he could carry. He donated them to a museum in Richmond, Virginia, where they reside today. But that was his story, how they, whatever they found there, he said it was a fun week for them to play frisbee with those china plates and stuff. And there's a lot of stories that I could take hours to tell you.
1973, my wife and I was in the Navy. We went to actually stationed in Augsburg, and it was about April of '73 that the person who actually was our sponsor in Germany took us to Doc Howe. And back then, there was snow on the ground. I could just imagine how horrible the conditions must have been back then. And what I found quite disturbing and quite surprising was the fact that you could still actually smell in the chambers. Had a horrific odor to it. Does that still exist today? When you were there last time, did you actually could still smell?
Not really, because they got rid of the entire German army camp.
Well, the chambers were the ovens that you were showing right
Yeah.
there were the exact same. They were still there.
Well, and after the war ended, I met a lot of German civilians, but to this day I never was able to meet one that said they were a Nazi.
Maybe I think you have a question over
Yeah.
here. Greg have one.
You mentioned when you approached the train, when you first got there. Was
Yeah.
that with your brother?
Yeah,
Your brother, what was his name?
Howard.
Howard, okay.
Yeah.
My memory, I was just trying to remember that.
Yeah, he moved to Atlanta before I did. When I got here, I found out he was telling people he was my younger brother, which he was by 10 minutes. So when they would tell me that, I'd say, yeah, he's telling you the truth. He's my younger brother. I'm the original, he's the copy.
Hey, a quick question. There's a famous story about the liberation of Doc Howe. I think it was the 45th Infantry Division
Yeah.
that lined up some German guards and shot them against the wall. What do you know about that? What do you know about retaliation?
Yeah. For a few years after the war, the 45th Division claimed they were liberators of Doc Howe. But they, as I said, in combat, they were always on our left. So they came in from our left. They came into the German army camp. We came in to the prisoner camp. Now, official records prove that 42nd Division liberated the prisoner camp. It just so happened the picture of the surrender that I showed took place in front of, at the entrance of the German army camp, not the prisoner camp. Because the SS officer who was arranging the surrender was stationed, he was waiting outside the army camp for General Linden to show up with his group. There was a Lieutenant Colonel Sparks. At the time, I think he was just a lieutenant. He wrote a book. A friend of mine many years ago sent me the audio version of the book. He told me, because it's a lot of cassettes, he told me which cassette to listen to. The only one I listened to it. And I listened to that thing. In fact, a movie was made on Netflix, shown last year on Netflix, based on that book. Total lie. Sparks claimed that he was there with his entourage in front at the German army camp when Brigadier General Henning Linden from the 42nd came with his bodyguards and the Swiss Red Cross representative and so forth to accept the surrender. Sparks claimed he told General Linden, "Get lost, I'm in charge here." General Linden says, "I'm sorry, I have orders from Commanding General Harry Collins to be here to arrange the surrender of the prisoner camp." Sparks claimed he took his .45 out, pointed it at General Collins. Now here General Linden is standing there with his bodyguards, with their ammunition, their guns, and he claimed he pointed his .45 at General Linden and said, "Vamoose, I'm in charge here." Now you believe that? I said, "That wasn't the army I served in." No way. If that would have really happened, he'd have been court-martialed and never heard from again. But that's what he claimed in his book, and that's what they said in the movie. A guy contacted me. His father was in the 42nd Division. He saw the movie. He contacted me and asked me for my help, wanted me to contact Netflix and set the record straight. I said, I'll be glad to do that. Have you contacted him? He said, yeah. I said, well, did you get any response? He said, no. I said, well, that's the response I'm going to get. Once it's produced, they don't care. I witnessed, early last year, I witnessed a Zoom program produced by a company, a group in Seattle, Washington. They had a college professor there presenting the liberation of 3 camps, Buchenwald, Ohrdruf, and the third one was Doc Howe. He saved Doc Howe for last. He spoke. He never even mentioned the 42nd Division about Doc Howe. He said the 45th Division liberated Doc Howe, and that's what he spoke about. So during a question and answer period, you could send an email with a question. So I sent an email. I said, I don't have a question, but I'd like to set the record straight. This college professor was wrong in his presentation about Doc Howe. They answered me back and they said, I said, because I was there, day of liberation. They answered me back and says, we're very interested. We'll get in touch with you next week. Have you heard from them? I've never heard from them. Once it's produced, they don't care. It's the way it works. They just don't care. Once it's produced, it's done, it's distributed, they don't care. But meanwhile, over the years, I've read about, I've talked to in person so many soldiers that said they were in Patton's army. I started doing the arithmetic one day and I came up with the conclusion, Patton's army must have been at least 2 million men. Had to be. You know, in the same way with liberating of whatever. There are certain guys, Martha McCollum on Fox News. Last year, she had a program, she interviewed a World War II veteran. I don't doubt he was a World War II veteran. In the interview on television, he said, she asked him a question about, he said, I understand you were at the liberation of Doc Howe. He says, certainly I was at the liberation of Doc Howe. That's all he said. But I found out the unit he was attached to. They liberated one of the sub-camps. I went on their website and it pointed out the name of the sub-camp they liberated. It was 40 miles away from the main camp. But he presented it on the basis that he was at the liberation of all these thousands of prisoners and so forth. Then the same guy was interviewed, this guy Adam Carolla. He's a comedian. In fact, I saw him last night on Fox News. He has a call-in program on the radio. He interviewed the same guy, same thing. I started to contact both of them and say, why don't you get the record straight? They don't care. Why waste my time? You know, it's a little thing, but there's so much that goes on. And it's true about a lot of things that are misrepresented as far as history is concerned. Not only World War II, but I'm sure the Korean War, the Vietnam War, you name it. In my humble opinion, World War II was the last war this country fought to win without political influence. That was the difference. It's been a political war ever since. So I hope and pray that this country never goes into another war unless it's a war to win and keep the politics out of it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.